Welcome to HarmonyTALK, a podcast of conversations with dreamers and doers, people who fulfill a passion in life and share their journey with us. They come from all walks of life: authors, artists, entrepreneurs, social impact inventors, and scientists. This podcast is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance company started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Today, our guest is Nancy Thode, who has written a wonderful book about a fascinating author, her mother, Anne Head. Ahead of her time, the trailblazing life and literary legacy of Anne Head. Nancy joins us from her vacation home in South Carolina, where both she and her mother grew up. Now, Anne Head wrote dozens of short stories in her heyday, primarily the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Many of them stories of young couples coping with war and its aftermath. They were published in the magazines of the times, McCall's, Colliers, the Ladies' Home Journal, and Redbook, to name a few. She also wrote at least 9 novels, including one that eventually became a movie, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. Most of Anne Head's publications, however, are out of print today, even though she is considered one of South Carolina's premier authors, and not that long ago was inducted into the South Carolina Academy of Authors. Anne Head was also a mentor to a fellow Southern writer, Pat Conroy, who later said, "Every time I publish a book, I put a rose on Anne Head's grave." 2 of Conroy's novels, Prince of Tides and The Great Santini, were made into movies and nominated for Oscars. Thode's book, Ahead of Her Time, The Trailblazing Life and Literary Legacy of Anne Head, and here is the cover of that book, which I absolutely love. I don't know if that is your mother in that picture, is it?
It is. It's a picture, actually, I remember taking when I was a little kid. She was sitting on the lawn. Now they have her sitting on a bridge. And that is actually a picture of Beaufort, South Carolina in the 1950s. They have her sitting on a bridge. She was phobic about bridges.
Right. In fact, we can talk about the unnamed trauma from her childhood. So let's just start at the beginning. What inspired you to write this book now, so many years after your mother's death in 1968 at the age of 52, and your own long career, not in publishing? I believe you were a social worker. So what inspired you to do this now?
Well, it had never occurred to me to write a biography of my mother, but one day I got a letter in the mail. It had gone through several addresses, and it said, "Dear Mrs. Thode, I think you're the daughter of Anne Head. I've always been enamored by her work. I wonder if you have any of her papers." And it was signed by Harlan Green, who was the archivist at the College of Charleston. So I met with Harlan in Charleston a few months later and told him about my mother and talked about her life. And he's a published biographer himself, and he was like, "Oh my goodness, you have got to write her biography. That is such a great story. That's got to be told." And I was like, "Well, I don't know how to do that." And he said, "Well, I'll help you. I'll mentor you." And he did every step of the way. So that's how it came to be. I mean, I'd been curious about getting to know my mother for several years before that. So I think he was the spark. But she died so young, and who knows their mother when they're a kid or even when they're in the 20s, you don't really know your mother's just your mother. So I had started being curious and also interested in her name and her work being recognized in the lexicon, and she had sort of disappeared from view. So I had made some sort of forays into that before I got the letter. So I think it was a mutual spark.
Well, let's go back to the beginning of Anne's life. I mean, she came from what many might call Southern, even East Coast aristocracy. Her father, whose heritage included abolitionists, owned the Beaufort Gazette. He became a state senator. Her mother was from an elite Boston family, and Anne even went to the Cambridge School in the Boston area, which was a prep school for Radcliffe. So how did you think that informed her literary life, if at all?
Oh, I think immensely. She had the Southern blood. She had the very progressive family in South Carolina who her grandmother had come down from in New England to teach the freed slaves when Beaufort was liberated by the Union Army early in the war. Very, very progressive family in Beaufort. And her mother's family, however, and from Boston, her grandmother on that side, was quite the opposite. Life was run by the Blue Book. She was very much the Boston Brahmin, lived on Beacon Hill. If your family was not in the Blue Book, then they were children you could not play with, that sort of thing. So she had a real dichotomy in the values of her childhood because she grew up half time in Boston, living with her grandmother, going to school in Boston, and then half time in Beaufort. It was a family tradition to send your children north to school.
Well, her characters are not necessarily elite. They're kind of ordinary characters of the 1940s and 50s, but they are party people very often.
Yes. He was a
And
party person.
she was, in fact, let's just talk for a second about life with Anne. I mean, she sat at the typewriter every day listening to the music of Broadway and opera. And as I understand it, with, little rubber fingertips and a cigarette holder. She was very strict about writing during the day, but she rarely missed the cocktail hour at 5, as I understand it. So, what did you learn about your mother in writing this book? I mean, she supported the family.
I learned how afraid she was. I learned how much anxiety she carried throughout her life, and she managed not to convey that to me. She was afraid a lot of the time. She supported us single-handedly, which was unusual for a woman writer of that time, and probably unusual for a woman writer today to support their family with no outside help. And so it was all about, was the story going to sell or wasn't it going to sell? We really were living hand to mouth. And she made me a partner in that. When a story would sell, we would eat steak and buy new clothes. And if a story didn't sell, we'd eat shrimp off the shrimp boats and for 25 cents a bucket, by the way, and wear last year's clothes. I'd take a cut in my allowance from, 50 cents to 25 cents. And we were partners. She had a lot of trauma as a child, with some of which we really don't, it's a mystery. We don't quite understand what the original trauma was, but she grew up with a lot of phobias. And she chose a career that was anxiety provoking. So I learned that, and I learned how brave she was. I learned how she did not let her fears stop her. She persevered no matter what. I think that's one of the things I want people to take away from the book, that she was a role model. No matter what obstacles are in your way, no matter how much fear you have, you can persevere and lead a successful life.
I think you do get that from the book. I will say, having read the book, of course, I think she was a lot of fun.
She was a lot of fun. She had many, many friends. She was very social. She loved throwing dinner parties, and she loved collecting people. She loved people. She loved to get to know people. And even though she led a sort of an avant-garde life in small town Beaufort, South Carolina in the 50s and 60s, she was not only respected, but she was and admired, but she was loved. She was the kind of person that if something was going on in your life, she would show up at your door with a casserole or a book or flowers. Or she liked to cook, and she was very giving to people.
But she was also very dramatic. I mean, some of her life stories, kind of like literature imitating a life. The unnamed trauma that contributed that you mentioned earlier, but the birth of your half-sister. Oh my gosh. Please tell us that story.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the story because I want you to read the book. She'd always wanted to have more children, and she was a single woman, and she got pregnant and decided to have the baby in secret.
She was divorced at this time, and this was another lover.
She was divorced. She was divorced and single. I was 13 at the time, and she devised a story where she could have the baby, bring the baby back to Beaufort, South Carolina in 1957, pretend to adopt the baby, and everybody bought the story. Everybody bought the story. Believe it or not, I talked to my friends today and they said, oh, yeah, we bought it hook, line, and sinker. How she did that, the story she devised to make that happen, it's in the book.
Okay, I see you don't want to reveal. I did read the book, so I'll do you that favor of not revealing. I do. There was a glitch. One might call it a glitch. The book, ahead of her time, the Trailblazing Life and Legacy, Literary Legacy of Anne Head, includes many of your mother's short stories, and I want to thank you for that. I thought that was brilliant because, again, many of them are out of print, including her first published story, Carrot Top, in 1945, which is the tale of a young woman who's kind of a flirt, and her husband is off in the service of his country. Were these people that your mother actually knew?
No. She believed that fiction should be fiction. Sometimes she was discounting of her sister-in-law who wrote heavily autobiographical fiction. She thought, no, 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 fiction should be fiction. So she got ideas. She would cut out little vignettes from newspapers and magazines that sort of piqued her interest. Her journals would have little sentences that she would overhear that would spark an idea. But no, she went out of her way not to write about any specific person.
I think there's an essay in the book also where your mother is asked how she got her ideas. And I think she comes up with a sentence that she just thought of. The girl was not happy on the train. And immediately she said, there's your story. Who is the girl? Why is she not happy? Where is she going?
Yeah, what she talks about in the writer, and I love these articles from the writer, and I included both of those that she had written, the writer being a journal for writers at that era, because they give us a window into her processes. In this article, she talks about how early on she had no idea how writers got ideas. She said she read all she could about the process of writing, and people would talk about, oh, you work, 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 and but nobody talked about where do you get your ideas. And so she had to come up with this herself. And it was, as you said, sitting at the typewriter. And one day she just typed a sentence, says, there's a woman on a train. She's going somewhere. She doesn't like where she's going. Then she said, oh, okay, so let's see. Why doesn't she like where she's going? And where is she going? And then as she began to answer the questions, the story began to evolve and the characters began to evolve. And that's was her beginning of her learning that process of where the ideas come from. I think that's probably why she would keep these little tiny vignettes or sentences that she would overhear, from various places, like the hairdresser,
Right. Well, this probably also made her a wonderful teacher and eventually a mentor to Pat Conroy. But before we go there, do you have any favorite stories of hers? I liked Only to Return. I thought that was wonderfully moving.
Yes, yes. I have to say, there's several stories that she wrote that involve children. And the one that I included in the book is how a little girl deals with the trauma and upset in her family by playing with her paper dolls. And with her paper dolls, she invents a make-believe family who are perfect, and the mother and father get along perfectly and the children, are just wonderful. It's almost like it's a way of almost this little girl dissociating from the trauma in her family by going into the life of this perfect paper doll family. And my mother, even though she said she doesn't write autobiographically, as a child, paper dolls were very important in her life, writing and paper dolls. What I found out, somebody told me recently, which I didn't include in the book because I didn't know it at the time, was that when she was 10, she had the door to her room was very big, and she could open the door to her room, and behind the door, when it was half open, she could put a little desk, and that was her office. It was her office, and that's where she wrote when she was 10. And then I also know from her diaries that she had paper doll families that would go and stories that would go on with her paper dolls for weeks and weeks or months and months. I particularly like that story because I think there's maybe might be a little bit of autobiographical.
Well, her most popular novel is, of course, not about children, but it is about young people, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. And I guess at the time it was written, in the 60s, it was still a bit of a taboo, teenage pregnancy. It's about teenage pregnancy and marriage. Well, how would you describe the book?
It was a huge taboo. I mean, teenage pregnancy was very common back in the 50s and 60s. I mean, I knew in my class several girls that got pregnant. They had to leave school, of course. The boys didn't. It was not talked about. So when she wrote this book about a teenage pregnancy and how those children, they were 16, how they handled that and how their families handled that. One of her great gifts was that she could write about difficult subjects with humor and pathos, but not heavy-handedly. And the book went to a number of publishers, and they said, no, 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 you're not going to go there. I mean, because the book actually mentions, abortion. It mentions, how have they dealt with this whole issue? And they said the public isn't ready for this. And finally, Putnam Books published it. And she didn't write it for teenagers. She wrote it for adults, but it took off not only with adults. Adults loved it, but it also took off with young people and is credited with starting the young adult book genre. It was a huge hit, bestseller, published in many countries, and was on school reading lists for 50 years. Jonathan Haupt at the Pat Conroy Literary Center today says if it were out today, it would probably be banned.
Wow. I did manage to get a copy of that book also.
Yeah, that's not so easy to get. Yeah.
It was not easy to get. And I have to admit, the print, which is sort of yellowing and a little bit difficult to read, but I did enjoy the book. I thought the characters were so sincere, very real. Bojo and July, who are the main characters, the couple, wonderfully portrayed. And Bojo he was admirable in the end. So, but why do you think a book like this, well, the stories were in magazines, so maybe that's one of the reasons they're out of print, but why is this so hard to get? Why is it out of print?
I hope that will not continue to be the case. I think she died so young and so long ago that she sort of faded from view. I don't know how these things happen. I mean, I think, maybe things stay in print because, when people are gone a long time, maybe it's through some efforts of their publisher or their family. I'm hoping that by bringing her back into public view, that some of these wonderful books can be reprinted. Always in August was a mystery that was in a suspense novel that was published all over the world and, was vastly popular. That would be another one. And I still see reviews on Amazon occasionally for Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, people saying, oh, I read this, and it was so wonderful.
Well, it was made into a movie, I guess, quite a bit later.
It was made into a movie. They were in the process of making it into a movie when she died. Samuel Goldwyn Jr., I have a whole bin of correspondence between Ann Head and Sam Goldwyn about this. They wanted her to come to Hollywood to write the script, and she didn't want to leave her child and her husband. So they agreed that they would get a screenwriter in Hollywood and that she would work with the screenwriter to write it. And she was horrified by the script they came up with. And the correspondence between her and Sam Goldwyn is quite vehement. And then she died. And so then they went ahead with the movie. I would encourage people not to look at the movie. It's read the book, find the book, read the book.
Well, one of her big supporters, of course, was Pat Conroy. And in fact, she encouraged him to write The Great Santini, as I understand it. How did their relationship begin?
Well, Jean Norris was a English teacher in Beaufort, and he called Anne and said, would you consider teaching a creative writing class at Beaufort High School, just a few people? And she said no. She was terrified of public speaking. She would never do what I'm doing right now in a million years. But anyway, he wore her down, and she said, okay, I'll do it 1 year. And so she had a class of about 5 students. Pat Conroy was one of those. He was a senior at Beaufort High School. And there was just love at first sight. She was so awed by his writing, and he was awed by being in the presence of a real writer, a published writer. He spent a lot of his senior year at her house, sort of absorbing the life of a writer, and they became good friends. My sister tells me she was very jealous of him. She was, how old she was at the time, like 11 or something, 12. And she said, that she would hear her mother extolling the writing of this amazing young man. And she would say, well, what about my writing,
Now, did you meet him?
Yes, I met him, but I really didn't have that relationship or the connection with him because I was out of the house at the time. But I spent time with him later, particularly on Fripp Island. He and his wife, Cassandra, lived on Fripp, and he would come over the house and regale me about stories about Ann Head. When he was at the Citadel, he wrote wonderful letters to Anne, and she wrote wonderful letters to him. The ones that we found that still exist are in the book, and they're a lot of fun. He would write, "My darling Mrs. Morris," that was her married name at the time, and then sign them, "Passionately yours, Patrick." They're very cute letters and have a lot of humor in them, as you can imagine, of course.
He did write, I believe it's an autobiography, the cookbook. No, she's in that.
Yes. And he wrote a chapter about her called My First Novelist. Jonathan Halp said in the interview that we did just recently, he said that Pat Conroy had said, "Without Anne Head, I would probably have become a teacher." He said, "But I don't think I would have become a writer."
And I hope she knew that, because she, as you said, did not want to teach, and that she ended up really influencing somebody.
Yeah, unfortunately, she died before he was published. She would have been so proud of him. She actually took on talk about a brave woman. She took on the great Santini. She went over to his house and tried to convince him.
That being his father, right? Yeah.
Yes, Pat's father, right. He took on Pat's father, went over to the house with a catalog of Antioch College and saying, really don't think Patrick should go to the Citadel. I really think he'd be much better off at a place like Antioch. And the father evidently threw the catalog across the room and escorted her out, and then told Pat he had to resign from that commie woman's course. So they developed a plan, Pat and Anne, where he resigned from the course, but he still came and submitted his stories, but not officially.
So there was sort of a secret alliance there. She knew quite a few people. I think E.B. White was another one of her friends, was he not?
Yes, she befriended E.B. White and Catherine White. E.B. White was Charlotte's Web author of fame, and Catherine White was the editor of The New Yorker. So I think Catherine White was a more interesting mother than E.B. White, because she'd always hoped to get a story in The New Yorker, unfortunately never did. But they would come over to the house for drinks and dinner, and Catherine would be in the kitchen with Mother while she was cooking, and E.B. White, who was called Andy White, would be in the living room with Stacy, my sister, drawing her pictures of Charlotte. So that was very sweet.
That's a wonderful scene. Yeah. Now, you've mentioned several times about your mother dying young, and her life did end rather tragically. I mean, she suffered a stroke a day after a bit of a skirmish with her second husband, who was known to fly into rages. He was never blamed, of course, but questions linger. How do you deal with that today?
With difficulty. I think my sister's and my mother's death was tragic and sudden. She was 52, my sister was 13, and I was 26, I guess. And it was very sudden and very unexpected. It was a cerebral hemorrhage. There was a fight that night, the night that she had the cerebral hemorrhage. The details of that evening, my sister was there, and the details of that evening she really did not remember for 30 years. She dissociated. It was so traumatic. So the one thing I wanted to do in the book was to tell a whole story. I didn't want to sugarcoat anything. I wanted people to know, and I wanted people to know Anne Head, to know her fully. I wanted to know her fully, I guess. So I did include what Stacy remembered in the book, and it's hard to process. Yeah.
It is. The other thing is, there is a lead up to the second husband being rather manic, but she's so ebullient, Anne, in general, that to imagine her as an abused wife is kind of hard. And I don't know if she had lived longer, if that would have been something she even would have dealt with in her fiction.
I think she would have dealt with it in her life.
And her life first, maybe.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think she would have dealt with it in her life, and maybe in her fiction, but I think she would have dealt with it in her life. In some ways, she was very brave. She was adamant at protecting Stacy from her father's angers and rages. Stacy's very, very grateful even to this day for that.
I don't want to belabor the point because there's so much else about her life that was so wonderful. But your father, the engineer Howard Head, it was your mother who encouraged him to switch careers and follow his passion. And of course, he wasn't too successful for quite a while, and they had divorced. So your mother basically supported the family during that time. But eventually, his invention paid off, and he founded Head Skis, which was a very, very lucrative business. Was he supportive of your mother's literary endeavors?
Very much so. I have letters that he wrote to his sister while they were married. They were married from 1939, I guess, to 1944. And the letters that he wrote to his sister during that period have a lot about Anne's writing and how proud he is of her and how good she is and how I know the next story is going to sell, because this was in the very beginning of her career before things were selling. And so he was very, very supportive. He talked about her writing a play back in 1940. We have no record of that now. And then in the letters that they wrote to each other after the divorce, when Mother had moved down to Beaufort and he was still in Baltimore, he's very, very supportive of her writing.
Now, since this book was published, you've certainly been interviewed and given the opportunity to shine a light on your mother's work. And I know you've also helped establish a scholarship, I believe, in her name at a high school in Beaufort. Is that correct?
It's not exactly a scholarship. Anne had a prize for short story fiction. We did that 6 years ago now, and that's been wonderful. The English department of the high school has been very supportive, and we've gotten as many as 30 entries one year. We have family judges who get together by Zoom and discuss the stories and choose the winner. And then they do get a $500 prize, and they get their name on a plaque at the high school, and they get recognized by the Pat Conroy Literary Center, and they get their story published in one of the local newspapers. So it's been very rewarding. It feels very generative.
That's definitely a legacy, part of her legacy.
Yes, and a big part of Pat Conroy's legacy. That's what the Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort is all about, is supporting writers and supporting young people as well as established writers.
So obviously your hope is to get more of your mother's work in print and to kind of reconnect the world with her stories. How's that going?
Well, just as you mentioned, a lot of people have said to me how much they value having some of her stories in the back of the biography that I've written. So that's wonderful. I mean, I didn't know how that would be viewed. So that's wonderful. I'm hoping Evening Post Books, who published my book, has voiced an interest in maybe publishing some of her novelettes that were in magazines of the day. A novelette is kind of like a short novel. And some of the ones that I've read are absolutely wonderful and would be, I think great today. My sister and I would like to look into republishing some of her books, particularly Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. But her first published book, Fair with Rain, I'm rereading because my book club in Connecticut wanted to read it. And it's wonderful. It's a comedy about a family, So I'm hoping that we can go forward with that.
Well, I wish you the best of luck ahead of her time. Trailblazing Life and Literary Legacy of Anne Head can be found at AmazonBooks.com. And I wish you the best of luck, Nancy Thode, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
This has been a podcast brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Talk to you next time.